0345 6060 973. That is the number to call. What should happen to these children? Should they be immediately removed from those parents who have attempted to radicalise them, or is there a more nuanced approach? And more generally, what should happen to terrorists who have fought, or we believe have fought, on Syrian or Iraqi soil? Should we let them back in? Do we have any choice? 0345 6060 973. Abbas, as promised, is in Redbridge. Abbas, good morning.
Hi there, good morning, Matt. Just a couple of points, really. Number one, is there any hardened evidence that parents are actually radicalising their kids to go out and fight in Syria? Because I've not actually seen any. And if there is any, I'd be quite interested to learn about that.
This is how the Evening Standard put it, which implies that there is, quite apart from the fact that the Justice Secretary has said it's one of our greatest challenges. This is how they opened it. They said the number of children being groomed in the Islamic State death cult, that doesn't mean in Syria, it means here, in the Islamic State death cult, is one of Britain's greatest challenges. And here's the key bit: more will have to be removed from their families, implying that some already have been.
Yeah, but to make a statement doesn't prove your case. It just presents the fact that you presented a statement.
Well, I mean, you can suggest that the Secretary of State is lying through his teeth, but I think that would be a little unhelpful.
Well, I wouldn't say that. But what I would say is, as a reasonable, human being, I would say, well, where is the evidence? Because obviously we should base our opinions upon hardened evidence. There's lots of claims that are made that actually later are proved that they were grossly exaggerated for political gains or whatever. So I'm not going to dismiss it. I'm not going to say that the Secretary of State is necessarily lying.
But let's assume he's not lying, because he's not going to try and take children away from their parents if they're not being radicalised, is he?
No, of course not. I agree. But what I'm trying to say to you is that these are populist ideas, and they are ideas that make the public sort of feel, oh yes, the government is actually doing something, when in reality it may actually not be a feasible, route in the first place. I mean, for example, how would you ascertain whether children are being radicalised? Would you interview children? Would you ask children, what are your parents saying to you about this or about that? How do you? I mean, it's when you get to the nuts and bolts of the situation, I think it becomes virtually impossible to do that.
That's where social services would step in, surely. If it was social services who were entrusted with this, they would have to make an assessment, case by case, as our first caller Chelsea and Liverpool was saying, and that's the same in any cases of child welfare, isn't it? Isn't that? I mean, it may be complicated, but it's certainly it's certainly achievable.
Well, it's not really, because first of all, we have to define what is radicalised. Because for some people, if you teach your children that under Islam, physical acts of homosexuality, for example, are forbidden and they're sinful, that could be seen as radicalisation. Would you take the children away for that? I mean,
it's a very good question, because I find that obviously enormously objectionable. But let's make it a little bit more easier for ourselves. Let's focus on what the issue at hand is. And as I say, the Secretary of State says it is one of our great challenges. If a child is being taught that IS is a legitimate ideology, that the idea would be to set up some sort of Islamic State here in this country and abroad, and that it's worth dying in that cause, and it's quite obvious that any sane, rational person, such as you and myself, Abbas, would say that child is being radicalised. I don't think that... Look, if it cannot be proved, that's a different question. But the point is, where it can be proved, what should happen to that child? And I would have thought it should be taken out of the clutches of that parent until that parent can be shown to have been de-radicalised.
Well, I believe that any parent...
You must agree with that, don't you, Abbas? It's common sense.
Well, let me just answer the question. It's a good point. I believe that any parent that teaches their children to kill innocent people is acceptable, or to go and fight for terrorist organisations like IS and commit mass murder or murder is acceptable, or any other form of criminality, i.e., encouraging them to go and sell drugs because they're underage so they can't really get arrested, or they won't go to prison for it, or do burglary, because this happens as well, as we are aware, then of course those children should be taken into care because they're being abused.
Quite right.
It's not about Islamic radicalisation. It's criminality, and it's a criminal offence to go and teach somebody to go and kill innocent people or hurt people.
Well, now you're uncoupling any idea of Islam with murder? And that's a very difficult question. It's a really good one to wrestle with, because I've sat on a panel, I've chaired a panel before where I think 3 of the 4 guests were Muslim, and I think all of them, or at least 2 of them anyway, were, and I think that they were unanimous in saying that radical Islamic terror was nothing to do with the religion. And I find that quite difficult. Yes, it's a perversion of the religion. Yes, it's murder, and the Quran doesn't preach murder in any meaningful way if you interpret it properly, or as you would interpret it, Abbas. But to suggest that the religion is completely uncoupleable from the terror, I found quite tricky.
Well, I've listened to scholars on this subject as well, and what they've said is that, and not just, by the way, Islamic scholars, but even academics within this field of analysing terrorism and terrorists. And of course, the religion is used at one point, but the important thing here is that it is not the instigator or the propagator or the foundation. It is actually just the icing on the cake. It's the last piece of the puzzle that washes away, let's say, their conscience to allow them to do the sort of horrible things that they do. And confirmation bias, as we're aware, is a very, very powerful tool that all sorts of people use to justify horrible views and horrible acts. And so, of course, you can misinterpret, misrepresent, mistranslate the religion to justify what you've already set out to do, which is to take revenge against these evil Westerners who are invading your land and hurting your people. And so what you then finally do to justify that is you use that religion to sort of say that they don't use the religion. It would be, I think, disingenuous or inaccurate. But the important thing here is that people tend to put the cart before the horse, because what they presume and assume is that the propagator, the instigator, and the foundation is the religion, and everything else somehow comes afterwards, which is against what experts, non-Muslim and Muslim experts, are actually saying.
I think that's brilliantly put. I think that really is very powerfully and persuasively articulated, Abbas, because I think it does switch some people off if one simply says, it's got nothing to do with the religion. I think you have to be really careful in how we say that, because otherwise people think they're being taken for a ride. So clearly religion is in the mix. Clearly religion is used, as you say, for confirmation bias purposes. Clearly religion is used manipulatively to justify something, even in the person's own mind, whether it's in the person's own mind or by the person who is doing the radicalising in the first place, if someone's not being self-radicalised. And so to deny any religious involvement, I think, is dangerous. But you're quite right to reiterate a point, which I always try to do, which is that the core message of the Quran, as I understand it, from what I've read of the Quran, but also from what I've heard others, such as yourself, talk about it, is not one of murder and abuse. Clearly it's not. That's not to say, and I'll just jump in, just finish off to say, that's not to say that there aren't some very challenging passages in the Quran, that there aren't some very explicitly violent passages in the Quran, just as there are in the Bible, in the Old Testament. But it's a question, of course, you can't just simply pick up the Quranic text and interpret it literally. If you did that with the Bible, we'd be in a hell of a lot of bother as well. There have been centuries of interpretations, and the most established and interpretation of the Quran in this country is a benign and peaceful one.
And then the reality also, Matt, is that those verses are very specific and pertaining to very specific occasions where the Muslims are being either attacked or they're in warfare. I was listening to a very interesting scholar, an American guy, talking about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and he was describing some of these events that were going on in Arabia, where the Muslims were being persecuted, they were being attacked, they were being fought. And 2 people from Mecca, they go to Medina to join the Prophet there, because the Prophet had by that time left for Medina, and they wanted to fight in a war that was going to take place. But they said to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that we, however, have promised the Quraysh, the people who you are going to fight and they're going to fight you, that if they allow us to leave, we will never fight them. In other words, that we will never side with the Muslims. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, told them that you must abide by your treaty. In other words, we will not include you to fight with us against them. So in other words, if you have a visa for this country, England, and you have promised that you will abide by the law of the land, then under Islamic law, if you break that treaty, they are quite right to cancel your visa, cancel your stay, cancel your ability to live in England.
Well, Abbas, that may be your interpretation of the Quran, but of course, as I've been explaining, there are very, very few circumstances in which someone's passport can be taken away from them, even if they do break that covenant, as you describe it, in the Islamic tradition. Abbas, really interesting to speak to you. Our first caller, by the way, Chelsea, she's been back in touch, Chelsea from Liverpool, and says that she does actually agree with large parts of what Abbas is saying and feels that he's taking her point out of context a bit. I'm not sure whether you were or not, Abbas, but thank you, Chelsea, for getting back in touch. So, would you like to react to anything that Abbas or any of our other callers have said? Really interesting conversation. I hope you agree. 0345 6060 973.